The crash happened on a Tuesday, which I remember because Tuesday was the day the civilian transit manifest rolled over to a new numbering block, and I had just loaded fresh Chit stock into the stamp press when the ground shook and the holding bay lights went amber. I was not military. I want to be clear about that. I was a transit intake worker at Relay Station Dunmore. It was a waypoint facility for civilian overflow during the border repositioning. Not a garrison, not a command post, not anything that appeared on a tactical map. We processed refugees and displaced workers. We logged who came in, we issued documentation, and we passed them down the line. I had been doing that work for 11 years. My hands knew the stamp press the way a carpenter knows a hammer. It was not heroic work. It was necessary work, and there is a difference. When the alarm upgraded from amber to red, our station commander, a tired man named Voss, who had been counting down to his retirement since before I joined, told us there were incoming survivors from a vessel that had been hit above the outer corridor, not human survivors. He said that with a particular flatness, as if it were a logistical complication, rather than a statement about the nature of the universe. To his credit, Voss was a practical man. They came in through the East Bay, on gurneys and on foot. 5 of them. And the noise of the station stopped the moment they cleared the threshold. I had never seen Verath before. Few people at Dunmore had. They were larger than the transit files suggested, broader through the shoulder, the neck plating heavier. And 2 of the 5 were badly wounded, one being carried between the other 2, with a stillness that made me unsure she was alive. The 5th walked ahead of the group and stopped at my counter. This was my job. I was the first counter. I took the information. I issued the chit. I sent them through. The one who stopped at my counter was upright, though I could see a long scoring burn across the left side of its upper chest, the kind of wound that meant the battle had been close. Its eyes were a pale amber, slightly luminous in the holding bay light, and it looked at me with a steadiness that I found, in the moment, easier to meet than I expected. There was no aggression in it. There was exhaustion, and something underneath the exhaustion that I could not name then and can only approximate now as the look a person has when they have been moving very fast for a very long time and have only just been allowed to stop. I asked for identification in the standard way. Transit intake runs on standard procedure because standard procedure is what keeps a room orderly when everything outside the room is not. The alien, Verath, as I would later know was the closest phonetic rendering, produced a data chip from a sealed pocket and placed it on the reader. Chip was cracked. The reader gave me nothing. I had been in this situation before. With human refugees, documents get destroyed. People come through holding bays with nothing but the clothes they are wearing and a name they can speak aloud. The form exists for that. I pulled a paper transit chit from the fresh stock, thick gray-white paper, the kind that lasts, and I typed the intake number by hand, stamped the date block with the press, and wrote the phonetic approximation of the name in the notes field. I slid it across the counter. Verath looked at the chit for a moment. I remember thinking that I did not know whether paper documents meant anything to them, whether the gesture translated, whether I was handing over something meaningful or something absurd. I did not have time to find out. The station alarm changed tone. 3 short pulses, which meant the threat was no longer above the outer corridor. And Voss was already shouting. The evacuation sequence. I told Verath the direction, East Passage, Second Junction, the evacuation bay. The words came out the way they always do in a drill. Clear and fast and without weight. Because in a drill, you are not watching someone decide whether to trust them. Verath took the chit. I do not know what happened in the days that followed with any precision. The swarm, Voss called them the swarm, and it was accurate. There were enough of them that individual ships stopped being the relevant unit, moved through the outer corridor, and then through the middle corridor, and Dunmore was evacuated and then retaken and then lost again. I spent 4 months in secondary housing in the interior before I was cleared to return to transit work, and when I did, the station I returned to was a different building on a different routing line. The 5 Verath survivors were listed in the after-action records as evacuated to an unknown heading. The assumption, after the corridor fell, was that they had not made it through. I assumed that for 19 years, you do not hold on to the opposite assumption when there is no evidence to hold on to. You do what transit intake workers do, which is process the next form and the next form and the next form. And you do not spend your professional life grieving the people you could not follow past the second junction. I was working a counter in Dunmore's rebuilt station, the third version. They had gotten better at the construction by then. When my supervisor called me to the main bay on a morning that had begun unremarkably, there was a fleet in the outer corridor, she said. Verath. 17 ships. They had signaled a formal approach request and a single personal transit request, 1 passenger, no escort, civilian intake channel. Did not think about Sorath. 19 years is a long time, and Dunmore processed a great deal of traffic, pulled fresh Chit stock out of habit, and went to the counter. Sorath was broader than I remembered, the neck plating darker with age, the amber eyes, carrying something additional that had not been there before. A weight of time that I recognized because I had accumulated my own shin of it. The burn scar on the left upper chest had healed into a ridge of paler material that caught the holding bay light differently than the surrounding surface. Sorath placed both hands flat on the counter, a gesture I did not know, which looked formal, and reached into the left gauntlet seam with 2 fingers. The seam was not a pocket. It was structural, part of the armored layering, not designed for storage. Whatever had been folded there on purpose, against the inner surface for a very long time, and it came out slowly, handled with a care that was itself a kind of information. It was a transit chit. Gray-white paper, the thick kind, the date stamp from the old press, the one that had been lost when the station was evacuated the first time. The intake number from that numbering block. The one that had rolled over to fresh stock the morning of the crash, so this was as among the first issued. The phonetic approximation of the name in my handwriting in the notes field. The paper had been folded 4 times to fit the seam. The fold lines were permanent now, pressed into the fibers by years of being carried. The edges had worn to a slight softness, but the stamp was still legible, and the writing was still legible, and the intake number was still legible. And when Sorath set it on the counter between us, it lay flat with the care of something that had been unfolded and refolded many times and was known, by now, exactly how to open. I looked at it for a moment. Then I looked at Sorath. I do not have the words for the Verath expression that met me. I am not sure the expression has a direct translation. It contained the return, and the 19 years, and the fleet in the outer corridor, and the question of how a strip of stamped gray paper survives when ships and corridors and entire routing stations do not. It contains something that I can only describe as the acknowledgement of a debt that the debtor considers permanent, and the creditor had long since stopped expecting to be paid. I picked up the intake chit and placed it back on the counter, facing Sorath. Then I pulled a fresh chit from the stock, loaded it into the press, and stamped it. 1 per passenger, that is the procedure. That is what we do at the first counter. I slid the new one across. Sorath took it in both hands with the same care as the old one. I told them the direction: East Passage, second junction, Transit Bay. The words were the same words. The station was a different building. 19 years is a long time. And I had learned the directions to every version of the second junction we had ever built, because that is what you do when the work is necessary, and you intend to keep doing it. Sorath turned toward the East Passage. I did not watch them go. There was a queue behind them, and the queue does not wait. I picked up the old chit from the counter, the original, the one from the numbering block that rolled over on a Tuesday morning when the ground shook, and I folded it along its existing lines, because those were the lines it knew, and I put it in my left breast pocket. The fleet in the outer corridor waited. I processed the next form.